Spring of 1915, across the vast territories of the Ottoman Empire, entire communities were ordered from their homes with little notice and less explanation. Families carried what they could. Churches and schools were sealed. Columns of civilians began moving south and east under armed escort, told they were being relocated for their own safety. By the time the First World War drew to a close, an estimated 1 to 1.5 million Armenians were dead, and a civilization rooted in Anatolia for millennia had been shattered. What unfolded was not a sudden eruption of chaos, but a systematic campaign carried out under the cover of global war. Armenians had lived in eastern Anatolia and the South Caucasus since antiquity. As one of the earliest Christian peoples, they maintained a distinct language, church, and cultural identity. Within the Ottoman Empire, Armenians were classified as a non-Muslim millet or religious community, granted limited autonomy in matters of faith and education but subject to legal and social inequalities. By the 19th century, as nationalist movements reshaped Europe and imperial structures weakened, Armenians, like many other subject peoples, began pressing for reforms and greater security within the empire. The Ottoman state, struggling with territorial losses and internal dissent, responded unevenly. In the 1890s, under Sultan Abdul Hamid II, widespread massacres targeted Armenians in eastern provinces, resulting in the deaths of hundreds of thousands. These events deepened mistrust between Armenians and Ottoman authorities and left a legacy of fear. Yet the empire persisted, and Armenians remained an integral part of its social and economic life, particularly in commerce, crafts, and professional occupations. In 1908, the Young Turk Revolution brought a reformist movement known as the Committee of Union and Progress to power. Initially, it promised constitutional governance and equality among the empire's diverse populations. Many Armenians welcomed the change, hoping for meaningful reform. But the optimism proved fragile. In 1909, violence erupted in Adana, where tens of thousands of Armenians were killed in communal attacks. The new leadership consolidated power and increasingly embraced a vision of centralized control and demographic homogenization. The outbreak of the First World War in 1914 transformed political tensions into existential calculations. The Ottoman Empire entered the war on the side of the Central Powers. Its eastern frontier bordered the Russian Empire, which had its own Armenian population and was seen as a potential ally by some Armenian political groups. Ottoman leaders, including Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Semil Pasha, grew suspicious of Armenian loyalty, particularly after military defeats against Russian forces in the Caucasus. In early 1915, as Ottoman armies struggled on the Eastern Front, reports circulated of Armenian volunteers fighting alongside Russian troops. Although the scale and impact of these actions were limited, they reinforced existing suspicions within the Ottoman leadership. In April 1915, Armenian intellectuals, clergy, and community leaders in Constantinople were arrested. On April 24, hundreds were detained and later deported or killed. This date is widely regarded as the beginning of the genocide, marking the decapitation of Armenian civil leadership. Soon after, the Ottoman government implemented measures that went far beyond military security. In May 1915, the temporary law of deportation, known as the Texer Law, authorized the relocation of populations deemed a threat to national security. In practice, this law became the legal framework for the mass deportation of Armenians from Anatolia. Orders were transmitted through provincial authorities, instructing them to organize the removal of Armenian communities from their homes. Deportations began in eastern provinces such as Erzurum, Van, and Bitlis and expanded westward. Armenians were given short notice to prepare. Property was catalogued and often confiscated under subsequent regulations. Men of military age had already been conscripted into labor battalions, where many were separated and killed. Women, children, and the elderly were assembled into convoys and marched toward designated resettlement areas in the Syrian desert, particularly around Deir ez-Zor. The conditions of these marches were devastating. Food and water were scarce. Protection was inconsistent or absent. Bands of irregular fighters and local groups attacked convoys along the routes. Disease spread rapidly among those weakened by exhaustion and deprivation. While some local officials attempted to mitigate suffering, many participated in or facilitated the process. Surviving documentation, including telegrams and eyewitness accounts, indicates that the deportations were not merely relocations but part of a broader policy aimed at permanently removing Armenians from their historic lands. By late 1915 and into 1916, the scale of destruction had become evident to foreign observers. Diplomats, missionaries, and relief workers reported mass deportations and deaths. The United States ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau Sr., sent detailed dispatches describing what he characterized as a campaign of extermination. In May 1915, Britain, France, and Russia issued a joint declaration condemning what they called crimes against humanity and civilization. The term genocide did not yet exist. It would be coined decades later by Raphael Lemkin, who cited the Armenian case as a foundational example. As deportations continued, the Armenian presence in much of Anatolia was effectively erased. Villages were emptied. Churches were destroyed, repurposed, or abandoned. Properties were redistributed to Muslim refugees from the Balkans or to local populations. The economic consequences were significant. Armenians had played central roles in trade, agriculture, and skilled crafts. Their removal altered regional economies and shifted patterns of land ownership and commercial activity. The war's end in 1918 brought the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and the occupation of Constantinople by Allied forces. In the immediate aftermath, the new Ottoman government initiated a series of courts-martial to investigate wartime crimes. Several leading members of the Committee of Union and Progress were tried in absentia and sentenced to death. However, many had already fled the country. The trials were limited in scope and short-lived, overshadowed by political upheaval and the emergence of the Turkish nationalist movement under Mustafa Kemal. Between 1919 and 1923, the Turkish War of Independence reshaped Anatolia once again. Amid the conflict and subsequent population exchanges, the remaining Armenian communities in Asia Minor largely disappeared. The Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 established the boundaries of the modern Republic of Turkey but made no provision for a sovereign Armenian state in Anatolia. The demographic transformation that had begun during the war was effectively consolidated. For the Armenian survivors, dispersion became a defining reality. Hundreds of thousands found refuge in the Russian-controlled Caucasus, the Middle East, Europe, and the Americas. In 1918, the short-lived First Republic of Armenia was established in the Caucasus, but it faced severe challenges, including war, famine, and the influx of refugees. By 1920, it was incorporated into the Soviet Union. The Armenian diaspora grew across continents, forming communities that preserve language, religion, and memory. The human toll of the genocide extended beyond mortality figures. Families were fragmented. Cultural heritage sites were lost or transformed. Generations grew up separated from ancestral lands. The trauma carried into subsequent decades, shaping identity and political consciousness. In the diaspora, commemorations of April 24 became central to collective memory, reinforcing demands for recognition and justice. International legal concepts evolved in part as a response to such events. Raphael Lemkin, a Polish Jewish jurist, studied the Armenian case alongside the Holocaust when formulating the term genocide in the 1940s. His advocacy contributed to the adoption of the 1948 United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. Although the convention was not retroactive, the Armenian case became a reference point in discussions about state responsibility and the protection of minority populations. Debate over terminology and responsibility has persisted for more than a century. Many scholars and an increasing number of governments formally recognize the events of 1915 to 1916 as genocide. The Republic of Turkey disputes this characterization, acknowledging large-scale deaths but attributing them to civil strife, war conditions, and mutual violence rather than a centrally planned extermination policy. Historians continue to examine archival materials, demographic data, and contemporaneous accounts to clarify the mechanisms and intentions behind the deportations. Despite ongoing disputes, the demographic outcome is not contested. The Armenian population of Anatolia was almost entirely eliminated during and immediately after the First World War. Where millions once lived, only small remnants remained. The transformation was both physical and cultural, altering the composition of the region in lasting ways. In recent decades, efforts at reconciliation have emerged intermittently. Civil society initiatives in Turkey have sought to acknowledge shared histories and foster dialogue. Armenian and Turkish scholars have engaged in joint research projects. Yet political sensitivities remain high, and diplomatic relations between Armenia and Turkey have often been strained, shaped by unresolved historical grievances and regional geopolitics. The legacy of 1915 also influenced later events in the South Caucasus. Tensions between Armenians and neighboring populations, including conflicts over territory in the 20th and 21st centuries,
have been shaped in part by historical memory and displacement.
The past continues to inform national narratives and regional alliances.
Across the Armenian diaspora, memorials, museums, and educational institutions preserve the history of the genocide. In Yerevan, the Tsitsernekaberd Memorial Complex stands as a national site of remembrance. Each year, hundreds of thousands gather there to honor the victims. Similar commemorations take place in cities around the world, underscoring the global dimension of a tragedy that began within the borders of a collapsing empire. The events of 1915 to 1916 demonstrate how wartime fear, nationalist ideology, and centralized authority can converge with devastating consequences for minority populations.
Administrative decrees, transportation networks, and local officials were mobilized in a coordinated effort that redefined the demographic map of a region.
The destruction unfolded over months and years, embedded within the broader catastrophe of World War. More than a century later, the Armenian Genocide remains a defining chapter in modern history. It stands at the intersection of empire and nation-state, of war and identity, of memory and denial. The deportation orders issued in the spring of 1915 did more than move populations, they initiated a process that dismantled a people's presence in their ancestral homeland. The consequences continue to shape politics, law, and collective memory, reminding the world that the protection of vulnerable communities depends not only on promises of reform, but on sustained commitment to accountability and historical truth.